Convo by Fango. My name is Phil Nobile Jr. I'm the editor of Fangoria magazine, and I'm an on-camera contributor to a pair of documentaries called In Search of Darkness Part 1 and In Search of Darkness Part 2, which is out now. And I'm speaking with the writer and director, David Weiner.
Here I am.
Hello. Good to see you again.
Yeah. I'm glad you have your copy of part 2. I did promise you would get it, so I'm glad you have it in your hands.
You did. I appreciate that. And it's got a nice booklet here. There's all kinds of, info, which I like a good insert. We last talked in person filming your documentary mid-pandemic. I popped in and talked to you for a little bit.
Yeah, in Burbank, California. I really appreciate you coming all the way out to sit with us and socially distance and have me, as usual, I grill you for an extended period of time because you have a infinite amount of information in your brain and I can only get so much at a sitting.
We're going to come back to that, but I disagree with you. And I came to disagree with you even harder in watching this documentary, but we're going to get into that. But since you and I are advanced age and forgetful, and maybe we're boring and maybe people don't watch this whole thing, tell me the flash sale info right up front here about In Search of Darkness Part 2.
So In Search of Darkness Part 2, the sequel to In Search of Darkness, if you go to 80shorrordoc.com, 80s, 80shorrordoc.com between now and the midnight of Valentine's Day, February 14th, we are having a flash sale where you can get the one you held in your hand, a copy of In Search of Darkness Part 2. You could also get In Search of Darkness Part 1 as an add-on with that. And you get real cool posters. You get an enamel pin. You get all sorts of stuff. A digital copy of not only Part 1, but Part 2. You get a download of the soundtrack. And you also get access to our online Discord community. So it goes beyond the documentary. You get months and months of interaction with a very cool community that loves to share their thoughts on movies and collectibles and all that stuff. So anyway, if you really love 80s horror and you really enjoyed In Search of Darkness Part 1, this is another 4.5-hour journey. And we do limited manufacturing batches. So we're doing one now, and now's the time to jump on it. And if you dilly or you dally, you just won't be able to get it for who knows when. We don't even know when we're going to manufacture again.
Got it. And let's talk about that 4.5-hour documentary. Like, you're a gentleman who made a 4.5 documentary on 80s horror. And you might not expect someone who did such a thing to say, let me make another 4.5-hour documentary on 80s horror. Nevertheless, you persisted. And I assume it's because the demand was there. Your first doc was such a success. People snapped it up. People ran out to see it. It was all over my social media feeds forever. And clearly it was something people were very excited about.
Yeah.
So how do you sort of mathematically take that success, gauge it, and sort of get your yardstick and go, I think we can do another?
Well, we started with a crowdfunded project that was for a small documentary that ended up being a much bigger documentary than we ever expected. And when I say bigger, I mean the duration, but I also talk about the response to it. I mean, people really responded to this, whether it was from their support or just word of mouth. Couldn't have asked for a stronger positive response to this. But the thing is, after that, and while I was making this movie, where I only figured I'd be making one movie, taking a whole decade of material and trying to cram it into one film is next to impossible. There are just hundreds and hundreds of movies. In fact, during our interview, I asked you, how many movies do you think, came out in the decade? It's very hard to pinpoint when you look at the world output for it. So I made a very, very difficult decision when I did the first film to focus mostly on North American films. And I hoped in the back of my mind, not only by doing long interviews with many people, including yourself, but we'd have a lot of material, but there's also a lot of content that one day I could tackle. And so the opportunity did arise where executive producer Robin Block said, let's make another one. And I said, you mean we get the chance to do it? I get to make another 4.5-hour movie. Let's, and you'll let me do it. Let's do it. And so this time I could get a more world view. I can get a lot of talent that I wasn't able to get the first time around, for such as Tom Savini or Robert Englund or Nancy Allen or Linnea Quigley. Those are sort of four standouts where I would have loved to have them in the first one, but it didn't quite work out. So that's a long-winded response to say, I got a chance to do more. And so that means I could do more of the deep dive. I could do more of the sort of the B-sides and the deeper cuts, and include a lot of the franchise stuff that I just couldn't the first time around. And last I'll say is that it just scratches the surface. There's so much that we could do more.
All right. Well, I think that covered all my questions, and thanks for that. So
I'm nervous. This is the first time I've been on camera.
Yeah. How do you like it? We're gonna break that answer down a little bit though, because I want to get into some of the weeds of some of that stuff. The first thing I want to talk to you about is, why do you think, I'm going to use a word that people are going to get bristly about, but why do you think that we are stuck on 80s horror the way we are? I see little like movements happening here and there with the Zoomers and the younger millennials about 90s nostalgia, and that's starting to be a thing. But I don't see the deep bench in 90s horror that certainly is evident in 9 hours of documentary footage that you've released so far. I've even seen a podcast done by a dear friend of mine about 2000s horror, the aughts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those things are going to have their nostalgic moments in the sun, right? But you and I have been here for a while, and I feel like that 80s nostalgia has been going on for about 20 years now.
I think you ask a very interesting question, because something I've recognized over my years is that nostalgia for any decade, whatever it may be, about 20 years later, it starts to rear its head. 25, 30 years in, it's sort of entrenched in the pop culture, because the people who are controlling the pop culture, creating the content, are reliving their past. So, the example I use is the one that I was very familiar with, and that's growing up in the 70s, Happy Days, Sha Na Na, American Graffiti, that takes place early 60s, but it's all this sort of 50s nostalgia. And that was very much there. Back to the Future, it's all back to the 50s, reliving the 50s. And that's 20, 25, 30 years later. All of a sudden, there we are reliving the 50s. And all the people who grew up in that era loved it. As you progress, there was nostalgia for other decades following the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and we get to the 80s. But the 80s seems to have some staying power. That maybe because you and I are a little more dialed into it because we lived during that era, so arguably are a little more in tune with why it resonates. Other decades, other groups will want to relive. 90s, I would say, is really in right now. All the 90s music that we grew up in, that's everywhere. I mean, I went to Comic-Con the last time I could go to Comic-Con, and the house band was a nostalgia band playing all these 90 tunes, Blink 182 and Everclear and all that kind of stuff like that. So the answer is it's cyclical, but I do not quite have a bead on why 80s seems to retain its value longer. Maybe it's us and we just recognize it, or maybe there was something that was a little more escapist about that decade. That really sort of evolved from the 70s, where things changed, and I'll leave it at that.
Mm. Yeah, it just seems to resonate in ways that I think nostalgia previously hasn't. I mean, John Carpenter now has a recording and touring career based, let's be real, on his 80s scores, that people are revisiting and wanting more of, and so he's like cooking up variants now and serving them up on vinyl. It's
and showing the greatest hits behind him on while he's in concert, and everyone's going concert hooting and hollering for the theme to Escape from New York. Never thought I'd see the day, but I'm first in the front row if I could be there.
Yeah, I went and saw Goblin twice a couple of years ago. It's certainly resonating, and it's big business, obviously, and that's exciting stuff. But nevertheless, when you sit down and make an 80s horror documentary, you didn't get everybody, and that's part of the reason that you got excited about a second one, as you mentioned. Like,
absolutely.
Talk to me about the opportunity to circle back and get these heavy hitters like Tom Savini and Robert Englund and Linnea Quigley.
The first film, we wanted to get at least 40 people. We ended up getting around just shy of 50. And 40 was pretty ambitious too for for our budget for an indie doc. Um, and people kept on saying, once I was getting some momentum, landing talent and attaching talent and sitting down with talent, well, what about this person? What about that person? And I wished that I could get everybody. There was no one I wanted to say no to, but I had to draw a line at a certain point. And it was very important to me to get a nice wide variety of types of people, whether they were a writer, a director, in front of the camera, behind the camera, a composer, an entertainment journalist, or an expert, or just an influencer, or a very well-known fan who knows their stuff. I wanted to provide a nice broad spectrum of people who were there and who know about the material. Part two comes along, and of course there are lots of names that slip through the cracks. Like Tom Savini said yes to the first one, but we could never align the stars. I have a very fond memory of going to Pittsburgh, and in the same day I sat down with Tom Atkins and Doug Bradley, and they both said, "Oh, so you're going to be." Tom's coming in, right? And I'm like, he's in Ireland right now. We just could not get it to work. So we finally were able to lock him down, and the other names you mentioned. And it was just a real coup, I also have to say that part two, there was a lot of the major obstacle is also the big elephant in the room, and that's COVID. And, we were hoping to get a lot more names. We got 15 new names. I did 23 new interviews, meaning, folks like you, folks like Bill Moseley and Kane Hodder and Cassandra Peterson. We came back and I did another interview. So it's all brand new footage. But in terms of new faces, it's 15 new faces. But we didn't have, we sort of sat for 3 months saying, can we go out of the house? And so when you have a looming deadline to deliver a film that's 4.5 hours long by October, it's only so many people you can get. So I'm actually very proud of who we got for this film, and the variety of faces and names familiar and new to other people, like say Jackie Kong, for example, who did 2 great films. I think we got some really fun stuff and great material.
And expanding it into international meant you needed to hear some new voices, like I believe it's Goreta. Is that?
Yep. Jaretta. I always confuse the two. Yep.
Okay. She's a very lively new interview in this one, and she lends a lot of insight into some of the Italian horror films.
Absolutely. Yeah, she was there. She was in Italy, from Demons on to lots of great stuff. And so that was something I very much welcomed her perspective, to be able to say, well, you might perceive it to be some type of filmmaking here, but over there it's culturally resonant and it means something. So you guys just have to figure out the difference. But that's kind of the fun for any 80s horror fan who loves the breadth of what's available. When you pop in an Italian film and you immediately see the dubbing, but then you see, whether it's Argento or Bava or, anyone, it's mind-blowing cinema. And the first 5 minutes you just get used to the dubbing, and it doesn't matter because the imagery and the concepts are just insane. But I'd like to add also, and as you know, I got Shinya Tsukamoto, who directed Tetsuo the Iron Man in Tokyo, and had him sort of explain his reasoning and justifications behind that fever dream of a film, and that to me was real fun as well. And we used a translator for that.
Yep. Now I'm curious, just as someone who's dabbled in this space myself, I'm curious about your process. Do you create an outline saying these are the films I'm going to cover, this is how I'm going to get there to there, or is it more of a fishing trip when you're collecting these interviews and waiting to hear those moments that you're like, oh, I'm going to build something around this story that I just was told? Or is it a combo of the two? Tell me about your...
Yeah, it's very much a combination. Actually, the real great thing about part two compared to part one is that people who love part one or hate part one, you still said, where's this movie, where's that movie? And so we could literally interact with our community and say, what would you like to see for part two? And we came down with a list and had people vote, and I think I included every single one of those movies, maybe shy of one, that everyone wanted. But I put a list of films together. I outlined all the, as for people who are unfamiliar with this film structure, we go 1980 to 1989, where we do anywhere between 5, 7, 8, even 10 films, depending on the year. And then we have a chapter in between that talks about larger context, concepts. And it's a big chorus of people talking about it together. Of the various talent who's involved, whether they were in the movie or they just are fans of it or have knowledge about it. I outline more than I will ever be able to get to. And then I also list all the films that I wish people are knowledgeable about, and then we see if they are or not. So, when it comes to the folks who were there and part of the movement, they have their favorites and they're very knowledgeable, but some are more knowledgeable than others. Some only know their films more than what else came out in the decade. So it was very important to me, you kind of come around after you assemble a lot of this material to get people who are knowledgeable about the deep cuts and grill them like or Heather Wixon from Daily Dead, for example, just about, what about a lot of these other films, whether it's plots, whether it's an anecdote, whether it's a detail, whether it's what was left on the cutting room floor. And then I script it. I script it bite by bite by bite. So 4.5 hours is scripted literally bite by bite. And, when I can get a variety of people talking about one movie and I can get the best bits and create a nice story that everyone's telling together, all the better. Does that kind of answer your question?
It does sort of, but but the secret sauce of it is when and how and why you cut from these talking heads to the moments in the film. So I'm curious if you ingested yourself personally every one of these movies that they're talking about. Did you watch these whole things? Do you have a team of folks go like find me punctuation marks from this random 80s slasher movie, or is it all in your head?
Yes. No. It's really myself and my it is mostly in my head. I've seen most of these films beginning to end, but I work with the ultimate editor, Samuel Way. He's in the UK. And he's got every single one of these films. And so he's, whether he's seen them beginning to end or not, he's very well versed where he's got just the right intuition. So if someone's talking about a scene or a concept or just a theme, he can, whether it's a very literal, from this movie, you have this happening, that's easy enough to do. But when you talk about, say, Giallo films, you got to sift through a bunch of Giallo films and talk about, and maybe it's easy to go to the kill. It's harder to find a dialogue moment or a mise en scène or something like that to really sell the idea. So it's a time-consuming process.
Sure.
So the secret sauce, though, is really just sort of having the right instincts as to when to cut away and what to cut away and for how long, to just keep the story moving and have it be very relevant and not arbitrary.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I say it as someone who's seen rough cuts where the editor kind of put a clip in and you're like, it's not really, I mean, yes, it's from that film. That's not where we really want to go. I never felt that watching this. All your clips feel very on point to your story. And it's, and I guess I don't want to say I'm surprised because you're a professional, but like the idea that you turned this around as quickly as you did had me wondering if that stuff was all in the bank and ready to go, or how that process shook out a little bit.
No, you're allowed to be totally flabbergasted that I'm capable of doing this.
I'm in awe. Well, so here's the other thing that I think is great about the sequel, because you say I'm going to do a 4.5 hour movie about 80s horror. There's so many expectations. You've got to hit The Thing, and you've got to hit Christine, and you've got to hit all the benchmarks. And then this one, like this kind of doc at its worst, it's one of those convention Q&As where everyone knows the answer to the questions they're asking and they know what they're going to say. And it's like a campfire tale that everybody already has heard before. But in this one, we're kind of moving into archaeology a little bit. And we're digging up things that maybe people have never heard of. And I'm going to tell you the list of the stuff that's on my list after watching this doc.
Okay.
Night Beast is a movie that I either forgot I knew about or have never heard of. The Being, I need to see that immediately. Despite Joe Bob's warnings, the 1981 Nightmare is on my
Mhm.
list now. And I remember watching it on television as a kid, but I forgot the totality of Omen 3. So like I just knew it was Sam Neill, but the segment on Omen 3, the final conflict here, made me want to go revisit. So I'm going to dig into that one. But
Very cool.
I'm curious about if you had a moment like that as you're dugging through the 80s horror. Was there something here that was new to you?
The Unseen. Some guy named Phil
It's
told
still not in
me,
the. What the hell?
listen,
Ah,
listen. There are a couple films where I have a 4.5 hour movie, but I made about a 5.5 hour movie,
yeah.
and I still could have been gone. Kept going. So your piece lives in the ether somewhere. It's done. The Unseen piece is done. But I had to kill lots of babies, and
Yeah.
I feel extra badly. I will do an on-air apology because I think I told you, oh, you're gonna get the Unseen in this movie,
That's
and
right,
of
but I
course,
forgot. You're too
yeah,
honest. Good Lord, does this mean there's going to be a part 3?
there's gonna be a part 3.
Is there really?
Yeah, there is
Is this
actually.
an exclusive scoop here that's happening?
Robin Block has sort of put it out there that we are planning to do a part 3. We are planning to do a part 3. They're in the very early phases of figuring out how, when, why, where, and all that kind of stuff. But there's the underbelly of the beast has still yet to be explored, and there's still other. I mean, like, Monkey Shines didn't make the cut, and
Yeah,
yet, I mean, there are
sure.
so many things in there.
It was a prolific
Uh,
decade.
yeah, Serpent in the Rainbow,
Yeah.
whether it's well known or whether it's real obscure, like The Unseen, which is one that I did not know about, although I love Barbara Bach. And I'm like, well, this Stephen First. I mean, the way you describe it, it's wrong on so many levels. It's got to
Oh
be
yes.
right, and I've got to see that.
Yes.
So yeah,
Okay.
to answer your question, I do not claim to be the guy who's seen it all and know it all. I'm just not that person. But I'm always interested in learning more. I've learned so much about what is available, and there are a lot of things that I just knew about, but I had never seen, like the Boogans, for example. Like I never, I always knew about the Boogans, especially from that trailer, but I never saw it. So
Mhm.
now I know.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well, if you do a part 3 and you end up using my unseen story, I hope you bring me back anyway, because it's a dream of mine to, and I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but I watched another very long horror documentary, and they're interviewing a director, and then they cut to a still from the movie, and when they cut back, it's a different interview, and he has aged 5 or 10 years in
Well,
the
I was going to ask you, you get two choices. Do you want bearded or unbearded version?
well, if you deal with 3, I feel like you need to bring me back, and I want all 3 in that documentary.
Okay, that's right.
I want to run through a whole
Morph
Benjamin
the
Button
aging
type.
process.
Yeah, exactly. Um,
It can be done.
yes. So I have another question, and it's a little bit of a pretentious question, but do you think that what you're doing with this film, what we're doing in telling horror history, do you think it's important work? I feel like there's a weird irony in 2021 of you've got, more often than not, you've got any film in existence at your fingertips. You can be watching a movie sometimes 30 seconds after you've heard about it, right? Like
Mhm.
up to Edison's Frankenstein, which I only read about as a kid in Famous Monsters and didn't know you could watch it. You can watch anything just about right now. And that access is colliding in a very weird way with a culture that's gotten tragically incurious about its own past. Is that a diplomatic way of saying that? Um,
Yes,
so it
I have
when
thoughts
when you
about that.
when you can create a documentary like this that creates the splash that it does, that creates the energy and the noise that it does, it's sometimes the only thing keeping some of these titles alive in people's memories, right? And tell me what you think about that responsibility, I guess.
I don't see it as a responsibility. I don't feel the weight on my shoulders of being the only person telling this story. And I know we're not the only person telling the story. You told a wonderful example with horror noir. Crystal Lake Memories. We cover similar ground with some of the same cast members. But you can't rely on everyone to see every movie that's out there. I see this stuff as a wonderful time capsule for a generation of creators who are not getting any younger and not remembering things as clearly as they used to. But they still have the same fondness and enthusiasm for making these movies and for the reception that they get for it. So to be able to put it in a time capsule format, 4 hours long or 9 hours of filmmaking or however long, whether it's In Search of Darkness, part 1, 2, or 3, or whether it's any other documentary, I think all of this collectively is important because it does allow people to discover stuff that they've never seen before or heard about and seek it out. And sometimes it gets, as you talked about the digital divide, easy for me to say, it's harder and harder. While we have everything at our instant gratification fingertips, it is becoming harder and harder to get some of these titles that used to be able to get something that you can get at the video store. I want to go back very quickly to a thing you did bring up earlier in the previous question about, sort of the balance. There are people who know this stuff inside out. They know this material and they've seen it before. So, they're watching these movies and they're like, oh, well, I know that and I know that. Well, congratulations. That's excellent. Take that material and share it with the people who don't. I'm trying to find a balance where I'm trying to educate and infotain people with this material who've never seen this material before, yet try to cater to a whole group of people who know this stuff inside out, but appreciate seeing this and maybe learning some new stories. You can never please all the people at the same time, but I think these movies that we make are important, though I don't feel the responsibility. I do feel the responsibility, though, to get it right and not to misinform.
Yeah.
But these are a lot of opinions and enthusiasm as well.
Sure. Well, I think you can say that there are other people doing it and that there's Horror Noir and that there's Crystal Lake Memories, but I don't see anybody else talking about Jackie Kong's contributions to 80s genre. And in fact, there is probably a generation and a half that have never heard of Jackie Kong. So in a way, I think you send up that flare, and I think you're gonna see in sort of unexpected ways the fruits of that. And I do think it's important. I think that it's important that we cover these things. I've got this cover story on the new Fango about Ron Oliver, who no one was really talking about until very recently, about Prom Night 2 and 3. Like he created this little mini franchise that sort of wasn't allowed to take off back in the day. And we are coming around to like folks who do see the value in that and do think that it matters. Because I thought you handled the Jackie Kong segments beautifully. I thought what she said was so poignant and so untold. It's such an obvious thing to say, but she was telling an untold story, right? And I think that when you can broadcast these untold stories, even if you're smuggling them into this thing that maybe somebody's going to pick up for nostalgia, but you can kind of take them to school a little bit, I think that's exciting. And I think that's maybe the engine that should be driving this stuff.
Well, I appreciate you recognizing that. I'm a filmmaker who does not want to be overly didactic. I don't want to tell people how to think. I try and find varying points of view about the same thing, but I also think that there is a history there that does need to be mentioned and told. And if you're interested, you can find out more. It's why I don't when I talk about in the first part, the pop culture and the politics of the 80s, I bring things up, but I don't make judgments, nor do I, go down the rabbit hole with that stuff. That's your job if you're really interested to, take that and, go run with the ball. Filmmakers and their experiences and what they were up against, especially people who are, part of a minority sect, yet they were just pursuing their dreams, like Jackie Kong. She didn't care. She just wanted to kick ass and play the game so she could do what she wanted. And she had wonderful stories to tell about that. And I think they're inspirational to a whole generation of filmmakers who want to just be told yes and not you can't.
Well said. Something about, I mean, we actually crossed paths when we filmed that interview because you filmed her right before me.
Yeah.
And I was like, hello, nice to see you. And then her interview came up and I was like, oh, I was there for this one. But when you cut to the picture of her on set and she looks like she's all of 16 years old directing this movie, something about it just really struck me that that this woman was just in the trenches back in the day, and no one was giving her her due. And I don't know. I just think that maybe there's a real, like, a significant value to like history that's going to vanish, right?
She,
Otherwise.
just to sort of, continue on that point a little bit. I mean, I was inspired by the fact that she was not only looking out for herself to make a movie, but trying to do her best to populate the cast and crew to reflect her point of view in the world. So it was really kind of like an international buffet of qualified people behind the camera and in front of the camera. And whatever you might take away from that film in terms of its prowess in terms of storytelling, you can't deny that she achieved her vision, and she got it made. And it's a ridiculously, we're talking about Blood Diner, a ridiculously entertaining film. And just her moxie of just showing up at Martin Landau's acting class saying, "Hi, I don't want to act, but I have a script. Will you star in it?" And
He
he
does.
he does, and he brings in some of his Oscar-winning friends too. So, kudos
Yeah,
to Jackie Kong.
it was very cool. It's a cool moment in the doc, and it just stuck with me. So I just wanted to talk about that for a minute. Um, let's talk about the fact that you're also working on a doc called In Search of Tomorrow, an
Mhm.
80s sci-fi doc. Now, to the layman, me, that doesn't feel like a one-to-one in terms of landscape or subject matter, or like deep well of content in terms of like 80s horror versus 80s sci-fi. How will you approach that material, and will you approach it in a different way, given that your resources will probably be skewed in a different direction somewhat?
Well, that's a good question, because I think I think a lot of people, when they think of sci-fi movies in the 80s, a lot of people go to different sections, different subgenres. It's not all about in space or aliens. It's not necessarily Star Wars or, Predator, aliens. It's also about technology. It's also about the results, good and bad, of technology. So whether you're going to Blade Runner or you're going to The Road Warrior, that's sci-fi. So I was able to be like, well, do I get to do post-apocalyptic, Mad Max ripoffs? Does that qualify? What about time travel qualifies? Do I get to do mad scientists? Does The Fly and Swamp Thing, or Reanimator or whatever it may be, does that qualify? That all is sci-fi. So it's a real broad spectrum. We talk a lot about how, especially in the 80s, filmmakers really got comfortable and granted the permission to straddle genres. One of the films that a lot of people, when they see In Search of Darkness 1 and 2, they say, "Where's Aliens?" And I say to myself, well, there's plenty of horror in Aliens, but I think of it as a sci-fi film, but it's also an action film. What is it? It's a hybrid, Also, knowing in the back of my head that I get to do it for In Search of Tomorrow, I'm saving it.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, Superman 2. I mean, I just talked to Sarah Douglas, not only about Superman 2, but about Return of Swamp Thing and Solar Babies and an obscure movie she did called Nightfall. Um, you know, um, it gives me permission. I'm gonna get tangential, but you know exactly what I'm talking about. In Starlog magazine, Starlog was all about space, but they put James Bond on the cover, and no one bat an eye saying he doesn't belong, because he had gadgets, so he kind of qualifies. But we all love Bond for a variety of different reasons. But technically, War Games, Firefox, Blue Thunder, Megaforce, James Bond and gadgets, Project X, whatever it may be, if it had to do with technology driving the story or changing the trajectory of a plot point, that qualifies to be discussed about. So there's just a wealth of material. So I just gave you an extremely short answer to your question.
No, but I'm curious about it because it at first blush it doesn't seem to be as vast uh, a well of material as 80s horror, but I think you kind of changed my mind a little bit just now. So
Well, I think when you think about the sci-fi output of the 80s and you think about there's it's a stratified look at it. just like horror, you know. For horror, you had you know the wide theatrical releases that did well or got a lot of attention, you know. So you had The Shining, or you had Christine, whatever, you know, the any of the Elm Street films, any of the, you know, Friday the 13th films. But then you just had just a mountain of straight to video knockoffs and wannabes and never heard ofs, and we all fell in love with them for different reasons. Sci-fi as a whole is the same way. You know, for every Star Wars or Empire, you've got Battle Beyond the Stars, you've got Star Crash, you know, you've got you know, for every Alien, you've got Saturn III. You know, I mean, or Galaxina. You know, it just,
Wow.
when Blade Runner came out, when Road Warrior came out, when Star Wars came out, just to name three things where everyone wanted to do a movie like that. There's just a laundry list of films that are good, bad, and ugly that we either loved or hated or ignored or cherish to this day. You know, The Last Starfighter or Mac and Me. You know, it's important. These movies are important to all of us because we saw them at a time when mom and dad were saying, go just pop in a movie and we'll watch together, or we just want you to take care of yourself while we did something else, or you want to sneak off to the movie theater, or these movies aren't all necessarily about the movie themselves. It's about the experience we had when we got to see these movies, whether it was in the theater, at the drive-in, on cable, sneaking a rated R film when we probably shouldn't have. That's the story that we're telling here. And I think that's very much an important way of looking at the 80s, whether you're talking about horror or science fiction or fantasy or whatever genre you're talking about. There's more to it than just the movie itself.
Fair enough. If you could stuff the zeitgeist into a canon, and who among us wouldn't like to do that from time to time?
To
What?
stuff the zeitgeist?
Yes, to take the pop culture crowd and shove it into a canon and fire it at another era and give the In Search of Darkness treatment to another period of film, of horror maybe. What period would you want to tackle?
Well, we're going to 90s next.
You're going to do the
Um,
90s.
yeah, we're going to do the 90s next. That's a plan. I would love to do the 70s, but the problem with the 70s, and it's not a problem saying I won't do it or it won't be done. Problem with the 70s is that a lot of the folks who were there are really kind of no
Dead.
longer around or aging out, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, like, you know, I for excuse me, for Famous Monsters, I had the distinct pleasure of talking with Richard Donner about The Omen, and that was a treat for me. He's in his 90s now, and I knock on his door and he said, "I want to make Lethal Weapon 5, so leave me alone," you know. But I digress. It's one of those things where I'd love to tackle the 90s, perhaps. It's a very different dynamic. It's a very different story. It's a story that we have to figure out what is important about it. While there's huge fans of the 90s, and you know, everyone says, well, Scream or Flatliners, whatever it may be, you know, it's all there if you want to find it. But it's a different evolution for the genre, especially from practical effects trying to grapple with the you know, the baby steps of CGI and too much too soon, and also just as a something that resonated at the box office big in the 80s. It didn't so much in the 90s. So the video store really was sort of the catch-all for the genre for quite some time.
Right.
So those are the stories to tell.
But I would also imagine, and maybe I'm wrong, you can correct me, that your emotional connection to the 90s is probably going to be significantly different than it was to the 80s.
Hmm. It will be. It will be. I think it'll be more analytical than emotional.
Hmm.
I think I can find the emotion from the people who were there. I mean, I think I've found a formula that people connect to. Whether whatever decade we tackle, I think the enthusiasm of the participants for their own decade really there's some, you know, I think it resonates. I think people will feed off of that, and so it could really be from any decade. But I think the way you approach it and what you talk about and how you sort of break it apart is a different beast.
Got it. And you, for people who don't know, were the editor of Famous Monsters of Filmland back in 2015, 2016. are you more of a monster kid into the 50s and 60s? Was that where your inclination went?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, that's why I was so happy to be able to sort of tackle that for a chapter In Search of Tomorrow. Sorry, In Search of Darkness Part Two, because I really am a firm believer that we all stand on the shoulders of the generations before us that made strides and changed filmmaking bit by bit. So going all the way, and it's the same thing for In Search of Tomorrow. I mean, Metropolis has its place, and everything leading up after that, George Powell movies and Kubrick and everything leading up to the 80s, it's there to recognize the stepping stones. So for In Search of Darkness 1 and 2, it was important for me to not only not give a nod to those movies, but to have the people who were inspired by those films, whether it was say Tom Savini, who loved Creature from the Black Lagoon. Yes, I love it. We all love it, ideally. But then he saw Man of a Thousand Faces, and that told him, wait a minute, I could do that for a living. That changed my trajectory. These are the things where when you can draw a line from the inspiration and the influence to actually tackling it themselves, that to me is very interesting. And I was a total monster kid growing up. I was born in '68, so I grew up in '70s in the tri-state area, watching the 4:30 movie, and Monster Week and Planet of the Apes Week and Godzilla movies on WOR9 on Thanksgiving, to Mighty Joe Young and King Kong and Godzilla. And, you're well versed with that stuff. And that stuff is just the stuff that just makes me happy. And so I'm a monster kid before I'm a horror guy, but I love sci-fi, fantasy, horror, and everything in between. And I just love the escapism of all of it.
Are you excited for Godzilla versus Kong?
I'm cautiously optimistic. Team Godzilla.
Interesting, interesting. Okay. Gosh, what else do we want to get into here? I feel like we covered most of my questions. I do feel like this part two took a different tactic in terms of like sort of tapping the brakes and spending a little time living with some of these individuals. Like there's a Nancy Allen section that I didn't see coming, and I thought that was kind of interesting. And again, you sort of get to extrapolate beyond the 80s a little bit about how she came to be such a presence in 80s horror. You can't have that without talking about her time in the 70s. So I feel like you kind of like rewrote the rules for yourself a little bit in the second one, and able to sort of, like you said, talk about those monster kids and those, what that DNA of those older movies was that fed some of these folks. But how much of that was by necessity in terms of like wanting to get this thing to the length that you wanted it to, so that it could stand next to the original?
Oh, well, you know what? It wasn't really about the length. I've always was worried about the length, in that not that I wouldn't have enough material, is that I still have way too much material.
You mentioned, right.
So it's really about for those particular interviews, Tom Savini on Tom Savini, Robert Englund on Robert Englund, Quigley on Quigley, Nancy Allen on Nancy Allen. Going back to, I couldn't get them the first time, but I got them the second time. My biggest obstacle was, well, I already did Creepshow, or I already did Dress to Kill, or I already did, Nightmare on Elm Street,
right?
X through X. I do it again, but I've got these guys, so I just get their point of view on the same material, or does it feel redundant? Or can I have them talk about themselves and their careers and touch on some of these movies from their point of view, but also get their career spanning progression and their take on the genre and a little bit outside the genre. And Nancy Allen is a good one, because for her it's a crime if you're sitting down with Nancy Allen and you're only focusing on the 80s and you can't talk about Carrie. So it gives me a good excuse to talk about Carrie and include Carrie and why it's important. Of course, Stephen King is just entrenched in the DNA of 1980s horror, but it started with Brian De Palma and Carrie, and that was his first book. So having her talk about that's super important. So I kind of got two birds with one stone. I got a way to inject a little bit of fresh approach to the structure, and I also got to integrate the people that I wanted the first time, but I already covered that, so to speak. So I get to cover it a different way.
And I think that it was a smart choice because you tick the box. Not that you're trying to tick a box, but you're not bereft of any Elm Street one, but it's you're coming at it from another angle, and you're coming at it with it from his through his prism, which I think was a smart way to go.
And to that point with England, for example, we really did talk a lot about Nightmare on Elm Street and about Robert Englund in the first one, because we had Heather Langenkamp, and that was just a treat to get her perspective on that. But also my battle with the first one, just from what do I include and what do I not include, I felt I was damned if I did and damned if I didn't with sequels. I was like, well, I'm personally a completist, but I can't put every sequel to every Friday the 13th and every Nightmare on Elm Street, in there. But I kind of tried. But at a certain point, I said I probably shouldn't. But well, the people who want them, they're going to say, why didn't you do them all? Where's Elm Street 2? Why'd you just gloss over that? What's the meaning of that?
Yeah.
But other people took me to, put my feet to the fire, saying you relied heavily on all these sequels when there's all this other great stuff that you could have used for that time. So again, here's an opportunity. You get Robert Englund and Robert Russler, who are in this movie together. Robert Russler, who was also in Vamp, and I have him with Geddy Watanabe, which was a real treat. But they get to really dissect what part two was about, not only in how it resonates today with the gay community, but just what it was like when they were filming it, and if that was part of the experience and the intention, or if it was just another horror movie. And that to me was an interesting way to look at that. Was something that hadn't been done for In Search of Darkness.
Totally. And you're also navigating this documentary existing in a world where there's a feature length documentary about Elm Street 2 already. And so you're not wanting to step on toes or cover the same ground. And I think, you kind of had a challenge in that regard, and I think you handled it pretty well.
Thank you.
Vamp, there's no documentary about Vamp yet. So I was glad to see it, represented. I love Vamp. Gosh, I think I've hit everything I wanted to hit. Like, let's make sure people know once again where to go to get this documentary during this flash sale that's happening this week.
Yeah, 80shorrordoc.com between now and February 14th, Valentine's Day. So if you want to get a bleeding, bloody heart of a gift to your loved one, this is the perfect thing. 80shorrordoc.com. And all our socials are at 80shorrordoc.
There you go. I'll throw one last question at you. Since you already told me there's a part 3, who's the interview who got away? Who are you chasing in part 3?
Oh, so many. If you wanted them, that's the one. I can't say because I don't want to put it out there and not get them or get them. You know what I mean?
You tell me after we're done recording.
Yeah. I mean, and I do mean genuinely, like anyone and everyone, because there are still plenty of folks out there. But there, like for example, Bruce Campbell's definitely one. But if I get Bruce Campbell, I kind of have to do a Campbell on Campbell, don't I? Because I already covered Evil Dead 1 and 2, and and get him to talk about Maniac Cop and Maniac Cop 2. One of my favorite moments of In Search of Darkness Part 2 is Tom Atkins talking about Bill Lustig and why he wanted to kill them off. Bill Lustig, nuts.
Tom delivered every time.
Every time.
Good stuff.
One of the things about Tom Atkins that I've always loved Tom Atkins, but he's a folksy guy, and he's a straight shooter, but he's just really he's cool and relatable. I was pleasantly surprised that everyone just thinks he's the star of the movie each and every time of the documentary, because he gave a great interview, but everyone's sort of information and delivery is different. And his is a little more measured and direct, and everyone seems to really respond positively to that. So that makes me real happy.
Excellent.
And I will lastly say, the fact that I got him to sing the Halloween 3 song is just, I was like, stick a fork in me, I'm done.
Make it your ringtone.
Exactly.
David, thanks for talking with us. Congrats on the second doc. I hope it's a big success, and You got my number. Hit me up for the third one. I'll
Yeah, I
talk
really
again.
appreciate it, Phil. I want to ask you all sorts of questions, but you're interviewing me this time, so I guess I'll
That's
just
right.
you ask and I'll respond. But it's
There
it's
you go.
always a pleasure, and I think what you're doing with Fango is spectacular. And
Right.
having you and I sometimes have a chat here and there behind the scenes because I did Famous Monsters and you're doing Fangoria, and so I know a little bit. I know a thing or two about what it takes to really deliver a great magazine, and you're knocking it out of the park. And I think Fango is continuing to carry the torch of a magazine that's been around for quite some time. So keep on keeping on.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I'm going to sign off, and we'll see you all next time.